Chuck Norris was gone on Thursday, March 19, 2026. At 86 years old, the man who built his name on strength, discipline, and almost myth-like toughness had died after a sudden medical emergency in Hawaii. Early reports said he had been hospitalized in Kauai. The family confirmed his passing, but they didn't say exactly what caused it. No details. No explanation. First, it felt simple. A man in his mid-80s suffers a medical emergency. That happens. The news spread fast, and most people accepted it without question. But within hours, something started to feel off. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. There were delays in official statements. Confusion about where exactly he collapsed. Some reports said inside the home. Others hinted it happened before he even reached the hospital. Even the timeline didn't line up cleanly. And then came the detail that changed everything. His main residence, his private mansion, was suddenly being looked at by investigators. Not just local authorities. Federal agents. The FBI. That's when things stopped feeling normal. Because when someone passes away from natural causes, the FBI doesn't show up. They don't seal off areas. They don't start asking questions about security footage, locked rooms, or missing items. But in this case, they did. And once they stepped inside that mansion, what they found raised more questions than answers. The morning started quietly. Inside the Hawaii property where Chuck Norris had been staying, everything looked normal at first. Staff members moved through their usual routines. The house wasn't chaotic. There were no signs of panic. Until someone realized something was wrong. Accounts say he was found unresponsive. Exactly who found him hasn't been clearly confirmed. Some reports suggest a family member, others say a staff member. But whoever it was, they knew right away this wasn't something small. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived quickly. They worked on him inside the house before moving him toward medical care. By then, the situation was already critical. And here's where the first cracks start to show. People who were there later described small things that didn't add up. Furniture slightly out of place. A chair that looked like it had been moved quickly. Items on a nearby table that didn't look disturbed, but also didn't look naturally placed either. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, that's the reason. But enough to make someone pause. Even the position he was found in raised quiet questions. It didn't fully match what you'd expect from a sudden collapse due to a heart-related emergency. Not impossible, but not typical either. Then there was the timeline. The call to emergency services didn't happen immediately after he was last seen active. There was a gap. Not a huge one, but noticeable enough that investigators later focused on it. What happened during that gap? Nobody had a clear answer. When local authorities first looked at the situation, they treated it like a medical emergency. That's standard. No signs of forced entry. No obvious injuries. No immediate reason to suspect anything else. But the more they looked around, the less comfortable they felt closing the case quickly. Something about the scene didn't sit right. And that hesitation is what opened the door for something bigger. By the time the news hit the public, the explanation sounded simple. A medical emergency. Most outlets leaned toward a heart-related issue. At 86, it made sense. Even without a confirmed cause, people filled in the blanks themselves. And for a moment, that explanation held. Chuck Norris had lived a long life. A physically intense one. Years of martial arts, film work, training. It all takes a toll, even on someone as disciplined as him. But behind the scenes, not everyone was convinced. Doctors involved in the early reports were careful with their words. They didn't officially confirm a heart attack. They used broader terms, medical emergency, sudden condition, things like that. The family also stayed quiet on specifics. No detailed statement. No follow-up clarification. Just silence. That silence started to stand out. Then came another detail that added pressure to the situation. Some individuals close to the scene, people who weren't speaking publicly, began hinting that the environment didn't fully match a straightforward medical death. Nothing dramatic leaked. No accusations. Just uncertainty. At the same time, media outlets began noticing inconsistencies in the timeline. Small differences in reported times. confusion about where exactly he had been before being found. And then, quietly, the situation shifted. Instead of closing the case quickly, authorities slowed down. More questions were asked. More areas of the property were looked at. And eventually, a decision was made that changed the entire direction of the story. This wasn't going to be treated as just another natural death. Because when the FBI steps in, it means someone, somewhere, believed there was more to the story than what the public was being told. By the time local authorities took a second look at the scene, the tone had already changed. What started as a routine response was now turning into something slower, more careful. Officers began walking through the property again, this time paying attention to details they might have overlooked in the rush of a medical emergency. That's when the first real red flags showed up. It wasn't anything obvious like broken windows or forced entry. In fact, the house looked secure. Too secure, almost. Doors were locked. Security systems were active. But inside, things told a different story. One of the first things mentioned quietly was the living area. A chair near where Chuck Norris had been found looked slightly out of place. Not flipped over, not damaged, just positioned in a way that didn't feel natural. Like it had been moved quickly and then left there. On a nearby table, there were personal items, things he would normally keep close. But their arrangement didn't look right either. Again, nothing dramatic. Just off. Then there was the issue with the security system. The property had cameras. That much was known. But when officers tried to review footage from key areas inside the house, they ran into a problem. Some of it was missing. Not all of it. Just specific time windows. The same time window that covered the gap between when he was last seen active and when he was found unresponsive. At that point, concerns started to build. Because missing footage isn't something you ignore. It could be a technical issue. Systems fail all the time. But in a situation like this, timing matters. And the timing here didn't help. Then came another detail that made things even more uncomfortable. A door inside the mansion, leading to a private section of the house, was found locked. That by itself wasn't unusual. But what stood out was that it had been recently accessed, according to internal system logs. Someone had been in there. Recently. But no one at the scene could clearly explain who. When officers asked basic questions, who was here last night, who had access, who moved through the house, answers started to get vague. Not suspicious in an obvious way. Just unclear. And that lack of clarity is what pushed things further. Because at this point, it wasn't about proving something bad had happened. It was about admitting that something didn't make sense. And once that happens, cases don't stay simple for long. The decision didn't happen publicly. There was no big announcement at first. No press conference. No warning. But behind the scenes, the call was made. Federal involvement. When the FBI steps into a situation like this, it usually means one thing. Local authorities believe the case might go beyond what they can handle, or there's something that connects to a bigger picture. In this case, it wasn't just one issue. It was a combination of things. The missing security footage. The unclear timeline. The locked section of the house. And the fact that the person involved wasn't just anyone. Chuck Norris wasn't only a public figure. Over the years, he had connections, business dealings, and a level of influence that made any unusual situation around him sensitive. When FBI agents arrived, everything changed. The property was treated differently. Areas that had already been checked were sealed off again. New sections were opened. Access became restricted. People who had been casually answering questions before were now being formally interviewed. Phones were looked at. Call records were requested. Even staff members, people who had worked there for years, were asked to walk through their movements in detail. And then there was the mansion itself. Agents didn't just look at it as a home. They treated it like a full investigation site. Room by room. System by system. They focused heavily on the security network. Not just cameras, but access logs, digital records, anything that could show who moved where and when. That's when they realized something important. The missing footage wasn't random. It was selective. Certain cameras worked fine. Others didn't. Only during specific periods. That kind of pattern doesn't happen by accident very often. And once that possibility was on the table, the direction of the investigation shifted again. This was no longer about figuring out what might have gone wrong medically. Now it was about understanding what happened inside that house. In the hours no one could clearly explain, and why someone, or something, might have tried to make sure parts of that night were never seen. Once federal agents had full control of the property, the search went deeper. This wasn't a quick walkthrough anymore. Every room mattered. At first glance, the mansion still looked like what you'd expect from someone like Chuck Norris. Clean, organized, controlled. Nothing flashy out of place. No obvious signs of chaos. But the deeper they went, the more things started to stand out. One of the first areas that drew attention was a private office space. It wasn't unusual for him to have one, but what mattered was what was inside, and what wasn't. Drawers that looked recently opened. Files that weren't where they should have been. And most importantly, gaps. Agents could tell documents had been removed. Not scattered or stolen in a rush. Taken carefully. Like someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Then there was a locked storage area. It took time to get access, and when they finally did, the contents didn't match what anyone expected. Instead of just personal storage, there were boxes of older records, handwritten notes, and materials that didn't seem to connect clearly to his public life. Some of it looked decades old. Some of it looked recently handled. That mix raised questions. Why keep all of this here? And why had some of it been disturbed so recently? Another detail that caught attention was the security setup itself. This wasn't a basic system. It was layered. Multiple camera angles, internal monitoring, controlled access points. The kind of setup that suggests someone who valued privacy and control over their environment. But even with all that, there were blind spots. Not accidental ones. Areas where cameras didn't fully cover. Spots where movement could happen without being recorded. And when agents mapped those blind spots against the missing footage timeline, something started to form. Whoever moved through certain parts of the house that night knew exactly where they could and couldn't be seen. Then came one more detail that didn't sit right. A personal item, something he was known to keep close, was missing. Not something valuable in terms of money. Something personal. And no one could explain where it went. At that point, the mansion didn't feel like just a home anymore. It felt like a place where something had happened, and parts of it had been quietly erased. By now, the investigation wasn't just about what was found. It was about what wasn't there. FBI agents started building a timeline of Chuck Norris's final 24 hours. Every call, every movement, every person who entered or left the property, it all had to line up. But it didn't. There were gaps. Not huge, obvious holes. Just small stretches of time where nothing could be clearly confirmed. Moments where no one could say exactly what happened or who was around. And those small gaps started to stack up. Phone records became a major focus. Agents pulled logs from his personal phone, along with numbers tied to the household staff. Most of it looked normal. Routine calls, short conversations, nothing unusual. Except for one thing. There were a few calls that didn't fit. Unknown numbers. Short durations. No saved contacts. When agents tried to trace them, the results weren't clear. Some numbers led nowhere. Others appeared to be recently activated lines with almost no history. Then there was the issue of movement inside the house. Based on access logs and partial footage, someone had moved through multiple sections of the mansion during the same time window that was missing from the cameras. But no one admitted to it. Staff accounts didn't match the data. One person said they were in their room. Another said they had already left the property. But the system logs suggested otherwise. Not in a way you could immediately prove someone was lying, but enough to show that something didn't line up. And then came the detail that made things even harder to ignore. A vehicle connected to the property had been used that night. It wasn't taken far. No long trip. Just a short movement, out and back within a tight window of time. But no one reported using it. No one claimed responsibility. It was like parts of that night had been lived, but not remembered, or not admitted. And the more agents tried to connect everything, the more it felt like pieces were missing on purpose. Up to this point, most of what was happening stayed behind closed doors. But that didn't last. Information started leaking. Not full reports. Not official statements. Just small details. Enough to get attention. First, it was talk about the FBI being involved. Then came whispers about missing footage. Then questions about the timeline. Media outlets picked up on it fast. First, they were careful. Words like unconfirmed and sources say were everywhere. But once the story gained traction, it started to shift. Speculation took over. Online, things moved even faster. People began connecting dots, some real, some completely made up. Old interviews were pulled up. Past stories were re-examined. Every part of Chuck Norris's life was suddenly being looked at through a different lens. Some theories focused on his past connections. Others suggested personal conflicts that had never been public. A few went even further, claiming there were things about his private life that had been hidden for years. Most of it had no solid proof. But the atmosphere changed. This was no longer just about the death of a public figure. It had turned into a mystery. Even people close to him started choosing their words carefully. No one came out with strong statements. No one directly challenged the original explanation either. They just stayed cautious. And that caution only made things louder. Because when answers don't come, people start creating their own. And in this case, the gap between what was known and what was being said kept getting wider. By the time the investigation slowed down, there was no big public reveal. No press conference. No detailed breakdown. Just fragments. Small pieces of information that made their way out through sources, statements, and quiet confirmations. What became clear was this. Investigators were no longer fully comfortable calling it a simple natural death. The original idea of a heart attack didn't completely fit anymore. Not because it was impossible, but because other details didn't line up cleanly with it. One of the biggest issues was timing. Based on what agents gathered, the window between when Chuck Norris was last known to be okay and when he was found mattered more than anyone first thought. That gap wasn't empty. Something happened during that time. But what exactly? It wasn't clearly established. Then there was the condition of the scene. Nothing pointed directly to a struggle. Nothing clearly showed outside involvement either. But investigators noted that the environment had been altered. Small changes. Subtle ones. Enough to suggest that the scene may not have been left exactly as it was when everything first happened. The missing security footage remained one of the biggest concerns. By the end of the investigation, it was treated less like a technical glitch and more like something intentional. Not proven publicly, but strongly suspected. There were also questions around the unidentified calls and movements inside the house. Agents couldn't fully connect those pieces to a clear explanation. They existed. They were real. But they didn't lead to a single, simple conclusion. And that's where things stayed. Some inside the investigation reportedly believed the medical emergency was real, but possibly not the whole story. That something may have triggered it, or that something happened afterward that complicated everything. But without clear, undeniable proof, the case couldn't be pushed in a more serious direction. So officially, things stayed controlled. Careful wording. Limited details. No dramatic conclusions. Just enough to show that the situation was complicated. As weeks passed, the noise started to fade. Media coverage slowed down. News stories took over. And the case that once had everyone watching closely began to disappear from headlines. But the questions never really went away. People still wondered about that missing time. What actually happened in those hours no one could clearly explain. Why was the security footage incomplete, and only during the most important moments? Who made those calls? Who moved through the house that night? And why didn't the answers ever fully come out? The family of Chuck Norris stayed private. They didn't push back against the investigation. But they also didn't open the door to more questions. They kept things quiet, respectful, closed. For fans, it left a strange feeling. On one side, there was acceptance. A man lived a long life and passed away at 86 after a medical emergency. On the other side, there was doubt. Not loud, not aggressive, but there. Because once people hear that something doesn't add up, it's hard to ignore. Even without clear answers. Even without proof of anything bigger. The mansion eventually returned to being just a home again. The investigation ended without a clear public conclusion beyond what had already been said, and the story settled into that uncomfortable space between fact and mystery, where nothing is fully confirmed, but nothing feels completely finished either.